argument invalid?
Yes.
Do you think that the... Okay, well, sorry, so what's the faulty inference?
Premise 2.
Premise 2 isn't an inference, it's a premise.
The second premise, you would need to provide an argument to substantiate how an omniscient being is susceptible to Cartesian scenarios. That's my question. That's the argument that needs to be brought forth. That's the argument that they have failed for now almost going on a month.
No,
to
it's
bring.
not. You haven't failed to show anything. What we're saying is that if a mind exists without an external world, it's not logically entailed by the fact that you have beliefs, that your beliefs would be reliable, right? Because there's not any environmental factors that furnish the content of your beliefs, right? So yeah.
So why
So
are we
how do
talking
you?
about my beliefs? We're talking about an omniscient being's beliefs. See, this is the obfuscation. What is the
There's no...
argument to
Okay.
where...
I'm telling
Wait,
you by the fact that if a mind exists without an external world, then internalism is true. Internalism is just saying that the content of an agent's mind doesn't depend upon any environmental factors. That doesn't depend upon any external factors from the mind, right? So I don't see
yeah,
why you would contend against that premise.
I'm contending against you saying that this omniscient mind would be susceptible to Cartesian scenarios.
Oh my
I mean,
God,
can you
the
please
argument in question,
directly
the
respond to that
argument in
without obfuscating?
question, what's in contention is whether or not a mind that exists without an
No,
external
no,
world
I'm
could
I'm
be
asking
omniscient.
a clarifying question, and you keep failing to give me the argument.
Can someone just mute this guy? All he does is like bloviates
Can
and
you
goes on
answer
to.
the question?
This is
I
what
I'm
thought he
they
was
answering.
gonna
do.
answer.
I'm
Yes,
answering.
this is what they do.
I'm answering the question, fuckhead. So when I tell you.
When you tell me what?
Dude, he left. I think
He
he
got
can
Go
talk.
ahead,
removed.
Jack. Now you're up.
He
Yeah,
got
he got removed
removed.
because now he's calling people fuckhead. Yeah, so since he wants to be a child, he can go find a children's room to hang out in. So you're up, Jack.
Yeah, so if internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible.
Okay, and are Cartesian scenarios logically possible with an omniscient mind?
Well, look, assume that they're not, right? Assume that that would just be to contradict one of the premises. That would be to reject the premise, but it's not giving a reason to reject any premise. That's why it's a question begging argument to
It's not a
respond that
question
way.
begging argument because in the first premise, it's specifically talking about God, right?
No, it's a question begging argument. Look, I don't understand what you don't understand, right? If you are rendering an argument that shows that something that has these properties can't be omniscient, and then you say, well, it doesn't show that there can't be an omniscient entity of this type, then that's merely begging the question, because the whole point of the argument is to show that omniscience is impossible. So you can't just assert, like, if it's an argument that there is no omniscient entity of this kind, then it's just an argument that God doesn't exist if God is defined as omniscient.
Oh my God. I'm going to bring up his argument and read it to you since you need me to do that. I'm going to read it to you. Where's it at? All right.
Josh, when you say
Premise
omniscience
one.
is impossible, is that to say that it entails some contradiction?
Well, I'm arguing specifically to Darth Arianus's argument that he proposed to me, and I have it in text. Premise one: if the God of classical theism exists, then God sans creation exists as a mind without an external world. So let's stop right there. How are we defining the God of classical theism? The God of classical theism is an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent mind. So we're already exerting omniscience into the argument in the first premise. If God sans creations exist as a mind without an external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. But if God, by definition of classical theism, is one that has omniscience, then how could an omniscient mind be susceptible to Cartesian scenarios? That is specifically the question. That is the premise that is in question. And I'm asking for an argument to substantiate premise 2 if we are already under the assumption of the God of classical theism.
Yeah, you're not assuming it if you're arguing that it doesn't exist. That's the point. If you just assume it, then you're begging the question. That's the point.
No, it's already inserted, it's already granted in the first premise.
Look, you can just reword it so that there's not something, so that you're not paraphrasing God to be an omniscient thing.
Okay, perfect. So you're saying that Darth Arianus' argument is lacking proper verbiage.
Yeah, you can just rephrase it.
Okay, so you would agree that it's lacking proper verbiage,
I
and
don't
that
think
you
it
can come
has
up
to
with a
be,
better
no.
argument than. Okay, so then if it doesn't have to be, then let's use his exact argument that he sent me.
Yeah, if God has belief sans the external world, then internalism regarding mental content is true,
Mm-hmm.
right?
If
Internalism,
if he's by definition the classical God of theism, he is omniscient and knows all true propositions. Would him being deceived be a true proposition?
well, look, there are if
Can we
the
answer the question?
proposition, yeah. So I'm trying to tell you the logical form that shows if that's true, right? So we have a P. If there's an omniscient being, let's take it a very simple case where the structure of the argument is P implies not P, or not P implies P, because that's what you're trying to say, right? Now let's take it that way. If there's an omniscient being, then let the full premise be if there's an omniscient being, then there's not an omniscient being, right? Let that be the full premise. All that shows is if that proposition is true, then there's not, in fact, an omniscient being. You can deduce that from the classical laws of logic. So if
Yes,
that
and I
premise is
reject
true, then it
premise
shows that
two
there's
because
not a logic.
it doesn't
So,
show, it
what I'm
claims
trying
it.
to show you,
Premise
no,
two is
what
simply
I'm trying
just a
to, what I'm no,
claim
what
that
I'm
I
trying to show you,
witnessed.
what I'm trying to show you with that example is that you can assume, if you can assume in that conditional, P implies not P, and the conclusion from that is that it's not the case that P. Now that's
Yeah,
the uncharitable reading. That's that's the
Do
reading
you
that you're
believe in
trying
true
to give.
contradictions? Do you believe that contradictions can exist?
P implies not P is not a true contradiction.
so my question
So
is,
you don't know
if
what the fuck
I
you're talking about.
so you're literally just taking premise two and making it a claim. You're just claiming it. I'm asking for an argument to substantiate because I reject premise two. What is your argument?
The argument is that if internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are possible.
Yeah, then Cartesian scenarios, that is the claim. What is the argument for that?
Yeah, the argument is that there's nothing constraining your mental faculties. There's no external world constraining your mental faculties, such that your beliefs have to correspond with anything.
Uh-huh. And if your beliefs, if you are deceived, that would be a true contradiction, correct?
No.
No, I'm sorry, not a true contradiction. That would be a true proposition. If you are being deceived, then your deception would be a true proposition, correct?
Yeah, it would be true that you are deceived if you're deceived. That's a
Sure,
tautology. Yeah.
and if God's an omniscient mind, then he would know that he's being deceived because he knows all true propositions. Therefore, once again, provide me an argument to sustain premise two. I'm still waiting.
While
I
you're
don't
waiting,
understand
can you
what you're.
check your text messages, please? Thank you.
Yeah,
I don't understand what you're saying, right? I already
I
gave
know.
the argument. I already gave the argument, right? The argument is that
Yes,
there's nothing constraining your cognitive faculties. And if there's nothing constraining your cognitive faculties, then there's nothing stopping you from being wrong about anything.
exactly, which means you couldn't be deceived if you already know all true propositions. That's my point. So can you
Yeah, but
provide an argument for premise
the
two?
argument is that you don't know all true propositions. You can't know anything. So, like, look, if you wanted to, let's put it this way: if you wanted to classify God as an omniscient being, and you also wanted to classify God as having these properties that we're talking about, existing sans creation or whatever, then what's going to follow from that is that you have an omniscient being and you don't have an omniscient being, and it'll be reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah. So more obfuscation. I simply asked you a
No,
question
that wasn't.
earlier
How
that
was
you
that
still haven't
obfuscation? I don't
answered.
understand what you're saying. Did you not
Okay.
understand what
So
I
let me
said?
let me ask you the question again. If God is omniscient, then he would know all true propositions, which means that if he could be deceived, then he would know what he's being deceived about, because that would be a true proposition. He would know who's deceiving him or what's deceiving him, and he would know how to counter that deception. So then, no, it would logically entail that he's not susceptible to Cartesian scenarios. That's the logical entailment of the God of classical theism that's asserted in premise one. So if you're to say that he does, provide an argument for it without just making the claim again. I'm
No, look,
still waiting.
it follows. No, the claim follows from these other properties that God has. And if what you're saying is true, although I don't even know why you have to say, I don't even know why you'd have to go that far into bringing in this argument. You can just start with the proposition that God is omniscient. But
We are.
if you can
That's the
join
point.
that, if you can join that with the argument, then it follows that you have an incoherent view. The view then
No, it
is
doesn't
that,
follow that you have an incoherent view. It just follows that premise two is unsubstantiated. That's what follows.
well, you could deny premise two.
That's exactly what I'm doing. When academics have discussions and a premise is denied, an argument outside of that main
Yeah, but
syllogism is provided to substantiate that
yeah,
specific
but look,
premise.
I'm saying
I've been asking
it's
you
begging the
guys,
question.
hold on. I've been asking you guys for over a month to do that, and it's been crickets the whole time.
Yeah, so I provided an argument, right? You didn't even respond to the argument that I provided. I can write it
Yes, I
out if you
did. You
want.
just made the
But well, hold
assertion
on,
all
stop
over
over
again.
talking me, right? So I provided another argument, a supplemental argument for premise two, right? And you didn't respond to that argument. But irrespective of the fact that you're not responding to that argument, the conclusion of this argument is that omniscience is impossible. So you can't reject the premise by assuming the falsity of the conclusion. Because what you're saying is if there's an omniscient being, then premise two has to be false. But that's the conclusion of the argument, is that there's an omniscient being. So that's just begging
No,
the
that's
question.
not the
You're
conclusion of the
presupposing
argument.
the truth
You
of,
think?
yeah, you're presupposing the truth
Whoa,
of
whoa,
the
whoa, whoa, whoa,
conclusion in
whoa!
order to reject premise two.
Hold on. You're even more confused than I thought you were. You think that the conclusion to the argument is that there's an omniscient being?
No, look, I'm
That's what you
saying
just said.
no, look, I'm saying you're rejecting the conclusion. Your reason to think that premise two is false is because you reject the conclusion.
No,
That's
it's
begging the
because I'm
question.
assuming the assertion that's made in premise one.
No,
The
the
God of
assertion that's
classical theism, by definition, is omniscient. If you start with that, you're starting with a mind that knows all true propositions. A mind that knows all true propositions cannot be deceived. I reject premise two, provide an
yeah, but
argument.
look,
You see how they
if you start with
don't
your
actually
assumption,
engage with what I
you
say? They
start
just
with
go
your
off on
assumption.
another tangent.
I'm trying to address what you said. Stop over talking me, right?
All
So
you
what you
guys for the
said is
last
you're
month have
assuming.
been
Stop over
whining.
talking me. So what you assumed is you said that you assumed premise one. Now, if you assume premise one and you're loading that with the content that God is omniscient, then all that
I'm not
shows
loading
is
it.
that
No,
there's.
stop.
Sorry.
Stop being dishonest. Stop being dishonest. I'm not loading it. The God of classical theism, if you didn't know already, by definition is omniscient. I'm not loading shit. I'm looking at the syllogism that's given to me and the definitions of what we know about these things. The God of classical theism is omniscient by definition. I'm not loading anything.
That's what I meant by loading it, you fucking idiot. That's what I fucking meant by loading it. You're just a
So
fucking moron.
I'm
So
providing
if
an
you're
access
loading
to an
into,
argument that somebody. So you
yeah,
don't even
yeah.
know
So
what
if you're
loading means.
loading
Then
into the argument, stop fucking muting me. What the fuck? If you're loading into the
I didn't
Yeah,
mute
argument,
that
you.
was me because you can have a conversation without being so like with all the virility. And my kids are
Disrespectful,
listening
yeah.
to it on speakerphone, so if you don't mind taking it down a notch, I'd appreciate.
yeah. So if if part of the assumption, all that shows is that there's a reductio ad absurdum, right? All it shows is that there is an omniscient being and there's not an omniscient being, even on that construal, and that just shows that there's a contradiction in the set of concepts. That doesn't show that any premise of those things are false. You could just deny. That there is such thing as an omniscient being, and you could just deny that there's a God that exists. But that's just going to take the form. That's going to be true of all reductio ad absurdums, right? You can't pair them with the contradiction of the conclusion and get anything other than a reductio ad absurdum.
I thought you were going to respond to what I said.
I did respond to what you said.
You didn't. You just spouted the same BS that I've been getting from these guys for the last month. I deny premise 2. Provide an argument without just restating the same BS that I deny to begin with.
Yeah, if there's nothing, if Cartesian scenarios are if internalism regarding mental content is true, then there's nothing constraining your mental faculties. If there's nothing constraining your mental faculties, then there's no reason for any of your beliefs to be true. If there's no reason for any of your beliefs to be true, then there's no reason to believe any of your beliefs are true. If there's no reason to believe any of your beliefs are true, then you're not omniscient.
Okay, so his omniscience is what constrains his mental faculties.
It doesn't make sense to say that.
I mean, you can say that it
That's
doesn't
just
make
begging
sense.
the question.
It's
It's
not
just begging
begging
the
the
question.
question. It's not begging the question. We're starting off with the God of classical
No,
theism.
you're
I
not,
didn't
because
know
I
we
gave
were.
a supplemental
Oh my
argument.
God, this is
I
this
didn't
is
make a
ridiculous.
supplemental argument. The supplemental argument that I gave didn't have
No,
God in any of the premises.
you're just, it's all gobbledygook now. You don't even understand what you're talking about. I've asked you for an objection. You decide to keep spouting off the same BS that I've been hearing for the
I
last
gave
month.
you I gave
You
you a
guys aren't bringing
hypothetical
anything new.
syllogism.
I
I
know
gave you
I
a
know you
hypothetical
thought.
syllogism and modus ponens.
I'll mute you since I was talking to begin with and you
I gave you a
interrupted me.
hypothetical syllogism and modus ponens, and
Okay,
you didn't
so
fucking respond.
we're gonna mute you one more time, and if you unmute and overspeak me one more time, you're out of the room. Act like an adult, have some self-control. So what I was saying was that if you are to say that all minds are susceptible to Cartesian scenarios, provide me an argument for that without just saying, well, if mind internalism is true, then Cartesian scenarios are possible. I reject Cartesian scenarios are possible in an omniscient mind, aka the mind and the God that is presented in premise 1 of the argument that was given to me. So if premise 1 states omniscience already, that means there could be no possibility of non-omniscience. Provide an argument or sit down.
Yeah, okay, I already provided. So now you're getting confused. You don't even know what you're objecting to. You're objecting to premise 2, which is if internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. Now, I gave you an argument for that, right? I gave you an argument for Cartesian scenarios to be possible. That is,
In all minds?
what do you mean? It's not in all minds. It's if
Thank you.
internalism is true.
Thank you. So
If
provide an
internalism
argument
is
for
true.
all minds.
It's if internalism is true. It doesn't have to be for all minds. I don't think it's true. I don't think if you're an externalist, then obviously it doesn't apply. Cartesian scenarios aren't possible if externalism is true. So no, not for all minds. For only minds construed where internalism is
Okay.
possible.
So then you're saying that it's possible that the whole premise 1 is false.
No.
But you just said if this externalism is true, then it wouldn't be all minds. That's what I'm asking for. Are all minds susceptible to Cartesian scenarios? Yes or no?
No. Only if internalism is true.
Okay, if internalism is true, are all minds susceptible to Cartesian scenarios?
Yes.
Even omniscient minds?
Yeah, I mean, look,
Provide an argument.
you couldn't have an omniscient mind if internalism is true. That's the point of the argument.
That's the claim without an argument for it, dude. You just don't even know what you're talking about.
I have no idea how you can be this fucking confused and incoherent. It doesn't make any sense to me.
No.
Right? I gave the
Just
argument.
because you're
I gave the
confused doesn't mean that
argument.
I'm confused. You haven't given me an argument. You've given me a claim, and I've asked you to give me an argument for the claim, and you restate the claim.
Wait, Jack.
It's like I said. It's what you guys have been doing for the last month.
Jack, are you saying I'm actually trying to understand. So when you say internalism is true, right? You're basically just saying that the way consciousness works is through a nervous system, and if that's the case, if that's the only way there's consciousness, then your argument follows. Is that what you're saying?
No, not even close to that.
Okay,
Not even
so
remotely in the same ballpark.
then what do you? Okay, so I don't know what internalism or
So
externalism is. Then can you explain to me?
basically what he's saying is that if mind internalism is true, and mind internalism being that God can, or this mind can have knowledge and beliefs without an external world to predicate off of it. If all knowledge and beliefs can be held without an external world, then mind internalism is true. If all of your beliefs and knowledge are internal to your own mind, then Cartesian scenarios or scenarios to where your beliefs can be deceived is logically possible. But if we're starting off with an omniscient mind that knows all true propositions, that is being asserted in premise one of Darth's argument, then it would logically follow that there is no true proposition of God being deceived that is logically possible, that he could be deceived because he knows what would be deceiving himself, because he is omniscient. And they say it's just begging the question, but I say it's not begging the question because you already asserted the God of classical theism in the first premise. It's not, no, you cannot say it's begging the question when I'm simply just using the information that you've given within the first premise.
And what is premise one? Because that seems very obvious.
Look,
What's premise one?
if you were just given information from the first premise, then it just follows from classical logic. Because if you want to take the most charitable approach to the first premise, or the least charitable approach to the premise, which there is an omniscient being, right? If there's an omniscient being, then sorry, hold on a sec. If there was an omniscient being, then internalism regarding mental content is true, right? If you want to take that, then ultimately that's just going to lead you via hypothetical syllogism to the point where P implies not P. An omniscient being implies that there's no omniscient being, right? That's what it's going to commit you to. And so if it commits you to that, then that just shows you can follow from P implies not P. It follows from that alone that not P is true. You can deduce that from logic. So even if you took what you were saying, it still shows, even if you took what you were saying is true, it still shows that there's no omniscient being.
No, it doesn't. Because you're assuming the second premise. Provide an argument. Like we're going in circles now.
I already gave you an argument.
I'm bored. You haven't given me an argument. You've made claims and called them arguments.
I gave you. How many times I have to give you the same argument?
No more times. I'm sick and tired of watching you guys.
I gave you a hypothetical syllogism and then a modus ponens inference.
Okay, Jack, I'm sick and tired of watching you guys run in circles, holding on to this argument by a thread because it's all that you got. Just drop it and try a new one. It's not that bad. It's okay to have a bad argument.
I'm actually reading this for the first time. It's saying in premise one, if the God of classical theism exists, doesn't that mean an all-knowing God, Jack, or no?
Thank you. You get it, Moshi.
Wait, Jack, is that what it means? I just want to understand your argument.
Well, it doesn't have to mean that, but it's fine if it does mean that. If it does mean that, then if it does mean that, then it follows that there's no omniscient being just in virtue of the first premise. And he said he didn't reject the first premise. So he didn't reject the first premise. So that would be a huge mistake to make.
Because it seems like you.
Wait a minute. Is there a copy of this syllogism somewhere? Because I'm not the philosophy person, but it sounds like the first thing says
by implicit definition that it is requiring an omniscient God. And the second thing is saying, well, maybe not because of the definition.
I
The
just sent
second
you
thing
the
is saying, well,
syllogism,
no, an
Ben.
omniscient God doesn't exist. And so it's
Look at your
self-contradicting.
messages. Look at your
Because
messages.
Jack,
I just sent it.
even after we've mentioned this, you're still saying that, like, so I think maybe I'm not seeing something. That's why. So if the first one says that there's an omniscient God, and then the second one says that Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, can an omniscient God? Are you saying that it's possible for an omniscient God to be deceived? Is that what you're saying, or no?
Uh, no, the fallout of the argument is if God is understood as existing,
Mm-hmm.
um, if God is understood as existing without an external world, then my internalism about mental content is true. Now, what you could say is that God is understood to be omniscient, right? So if that's true, if God is supposed to be understood to be omniscient, then if this argument is correct, then that implies that externalism about mental content has to be true. It has to show that externalism is false. So if you hold to the propositions that God exists sans an external world, then that commits you to the view that he's omniscient. If you hold the view that he's omniscient, then it commits you to the view that mind externalism is false. And so if you think the first premise is true, then those two, then that's going to lead you to the conclusion that internalism is true. And so since you believe that externalism is true because you believe that God is omniscient, then you have a contradictory worldview. It's a reductio ad absurdum.
But the argument that I'm reading here, it says that, like, if premise one is an omniscient God exists, like that's what's presupposed, and then the second point is this this mind can be deceived. I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, Jack. I'm just saying what I'm reading goes against what you're saying. So could you rewrite the argument in a way that
No, it doesn't
maybe
go against
fits what
what
you're
it
saying?
doesn't go. Look, that doesn't go against what you're saying. Even if what you said was true, that doesn't go against what's being said, right? Because I already phrased it the way that you're talking about to make it seem like it's initially absurd because we're already presupposing that there's an omniscient being. But even if we presuppose there's an omniscient being and the consequent of the implication is that there's not an omniscient being, that is to say, P implies not P, which is what you guys were trying to say, right? Then that just shows that not P is true.
Okay, so
Because under every
Okay,
interpretation,
so
because if P is true, then not P. Sorry, if P is true, then not P is true, and if not P is true, then not P is true, right? So under every interpretation of that conditional, we get to the result that not P. So that's an unfavorable route for you to go down to just say, well, we're presupposing omniscience with the first premise, because you can do that in logic, and that would just show that there is no omniscient agent.
yeah, so he
Wait, I
asked a
have a question.
very interesting question that you gave a very interesting answer to. And he's saying, are you saying that an omniscient mind is susceptible to Cartesian scenarios? And your answer was no.
I'm saying, look, I'm not saying that you have to say that. I'm saying because you can say that there is an omniscient mind and that externalism is true. So that's not what I'm saying.
No, no.
What's being said is if God is construed in such a way as to exist without an external world, then internalism has to be true.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
internalism is true,
we're already going off of internalism being true. You don't need to say, well, if externalism. No, we're already on the premise that mind internalism is true. Is an omniscient God with who knows all true propositions internally, is that God susceptible to Cartesian scenarios?
well, that's begging the question.
right, so then
No, it's not.
wait, so
It's
if
literally in the first premise, the
so
God
the
of
problem
classical theism.
so the problem is, Jack, is like, obviously it's absurd to say that something that's all knowing does not know something, right? That's obviously absurd. But in premise one, it's literally saying there's something that's all knowing, and then premise two, then there's a possibility that it doesn't know something. That's what I'm
So would
reading.
their
Yeah, the
argument just
argument is
make more
self-refuting.
sense if they removed classical theism? Like, is it really that simple as two words being removed from premise one to make their shit
Yeah,
make sense?
they could do that, But then they would have more arguments that they need to make to say it's necessarily for God's mind. It would still
Look,
end
I
up.
already said it doesn't have to be God. I already said that before. It doesn't matter, right?
Okay.
Okay, so
Well,
how
no,
about
but hold on, wait. Let's look at the conclusion. Let's look at the conclusion of this. Therefore, if the God of classical theism exists and Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, then the God of classical theism cannot exist. Just your argument, because apparently you think that Darth Arianus is lacking in some nature.
No, I got this argument from him.
No,
I can send you the
literally,
argument that I'm looking at. I just sent it to you.
does. Okay, let me see.
Premise one, if
I was
God
gonna
has
say, because
belief
that's
stands
how.
in external world, then internalism regarding mental content is true. If internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. If God has belief stands in external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. That's 1-2 hypothetical syllogism. If Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, then omniscience is logically impossible. Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. That's a premise. Therefore, through modus ponens 3 and 4, omniscience is logically impossible.
Okay, so that's different from what I got. So I'm dealing with the argument that was sent to me. And either way, even if we go with your argument, I'm still going to have the same questions, and you're still not going to have the answer.
What? I don't know what question you have.
If the God of classical theism exists, and that God of classical theism is defined as an omniscient mind, then God sans creation exists without an external world, fine. If God sans creation exists as a mind without an external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. I dismiss that when it comes to an omniscient mind, aka the God of classical theism that it's stated in the first premise. If you say, well, okay, we don't need to say it's the God of classical theism. If a mind exists, then creation exists as a mind without. Well, I mean, how would you reword premise one if you're not talking about God? Let's start there.
If there's a belief that has beliefs, or if there's a mind that has beliefs on an external world, then internalism regarding mental content is true.
Okay, and if that mind knows all true propositions, would it be susceptible to Cartesian scenarios?
Well, just look at the,
Can I just get an
replace
answer?
it. Just replace it. Well, I'm going to try to have you reason through it than just giving you the
Just
answer.
please start with a yes or no and then go through the reasoning.
I asked the question again.
Okay, so is an omniscient mind susceptible to Cartesian scenarios?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question. Is it the case that there exists an omniscient mind and that it doesn't know anything? Is that the question that you're asking?
No, my question is, there's an omniscient mind. Mind internalism is
Mm-hmm.
true. Is this omniscient mind through mind internalism susceptible to Cartesian scenarios?
Look, there's if you bake into the concept of an
You
omniscient
see how we're
mind,
not starting off with a yes or no and then explaining because we don't know.
yeah, because it's incoherent, right? If the
No, no,
question
no. Just
presupposes
because you don't
something
like the
incoherent.
question doesn't make it
The question
incoherent.
presupposes, well, let me explain why it's incoherent, right? Let me explain why it's incoherent, and then you can fucking object to it, right? So, if
No, no,
God
no.
is
I can
understood,
object
Yeah,
to it now
actually,
because I
if
haven't
you
been
don't
given an
mind
answer.
dumbing it down, because some of us aren't like avid students of philosophy.
yeah, that's
So,
fine. I don't have a problem dumbing it down. I'm trying to explain why it's incoherent, right? So, if we take it that mind internalism is understood to be this view that you can have knowledge without an external world, right? And God is going to be construed as such a mind, then it follows that God is not omniscient. And if we also take it true that God is defined as omniscient, then it follows that God is omniscient. So then you have a contradiction in the premise that God is omniscient and that God is not omniscient. And that's why the question doesn't make any sense.
Did you guys catch all the presuppositions that were inserted into that argument?
I presupposed what you asked me to presuppose.
I asked you to presuppose that God is an
God
omniscient
is
being, and by
omniscient.
omniscience he knows all true propositions. Cartesian scenarios are scenarios to which a mind could be deceived. That means that there's
About
knowledge
everything,
that is true that mind doesn't know about.
knowledge that is true that the mind doesn't know about. That doesn't make any sense.
Yes, if I'm being deceived, is there knowledge happening in real time that I don't know about?
If you're systematically deceived, then you don't know anything.
That's not what I asked, man. You have a hard time answering direct questions.
But the answer, what I thought to be was just no, because I thought that we're talking about whether or not you can be
Okay,
systematically
okay,
deceived,
okay.
which is
We're gonna break.
what's supposed to be true on Cartesian scenarios. If Cartesian scenarios are possible, what that means, via definition, is that systematical deception is impossible. If systematical deception is impossible, then knowledge is impossible.
Yeah, so we're gonna break this down super Barney style. So I'm hanging out with Chloe, right? And me and Chloe are walking through the park. And Chloe has already set up this whole thing with these mechanical dogs walking around. And I think that they're real dogs, right? But I'm being deceived because Chloe has information that these dogs are mechanical, and I think that they're real. So is there information present in real time that I don't know of?
Not if Cartesian scenarios are possible. I mean, if Cartesian scenarios are possible, yes, that's true.
Okay,
There'll be all
perfect.
sorts of stuff that you're unaware of.
Perfect. But
In
if
fact,
the
you could be
God of
systematically deceived.
Okay, hold on. If the God of classical theism knows all true propositions, is it possible that there's knowledge that he doesn't know about?
Knowledge that he doesn't know about.
Yes,
What the
is there
fuck?
true propositions that he doesn't know about if he's omniscient?
Well, let me
The answer is
ask you:
no,
are you
which
saying
is
is
why
there
I
a true
reject
proposition that he
premise
does?
two. It's super simple.
No, it's not super simple. You're saying a bunch of confused questions, and you won't rigorously analyze them, right? So that's why I'm
I
trying
mean,
to
the
get
other
clarity on the questions.
I've had many people in here, throughout the last month that has completely agreed with my objection, and they get it. It's very, very simple. If we're starting with the God of classical theism, that by definition is a mind that knows all true propositions. If you know all true propositions, you can't be deceived, because being deceived means that there's information that you don't have. An omniscient mind has all the informations, therefore, there is no way that an omniscient mind could be deceived. Period, point blank. That's my argument refuting premise two of the argument that was given to me about Cartesian scenarios. Now provide an objection and an argument that shows that an omniscient mind is necessarily susceptible to Cartesian scenarios. I'll
Okay,
wait
but
like I have for the last month.
I don't understand why you don't understand how that's begging the question. If the only reason to reject premise two is that you reject the conclusion, right? Because premise two, because if you think that omniscience is possible, then premise two is false. So basically, it's saying if omniscience is possible, then premise two is false. Right. Let me just make it even clearer. If omniscience is possible and it's the case that internalism is true, then premise two is false, right? Um, yeah, that should be true, but that's just because you're presupposing the truth, the negation of the conclusion,
Oh, dude,
which is that
I'm done.
omniscience
I'm
is
done. You still don't
impossible.
get it. I'm done. I'm done with this,
Well,
bro.
you're
Like
begging the
you
question.
still don't get. I'm not begging the question. I'm taking
It
the
does beg the
information that's
question.
already given to me in premise one. Oh my God, I'm trying to stay calm with you, but like this is so nonsensical what you're doing right now. It frustrates me that the human race doesn't even understand simple stuff like this.
I mean, you don't even understand that you're begging the question.
You don't understand how I'm not begging the question, how I'm literally just going through the information that's given to me, presupposed in the argument by the first premise. In the first premise, there is if the God of classical theism exists. That means that we are already inserting an omniscient mind that knows all true propositions. If that's
Yeah,
the
it just
case, then
follows.
I'm
It just
wait,
follows that there
wait,
is.
wait,
It just
then
follow. I'm
I'm
just
not,
saying. It just follows.
wait. If that's true, that we are inserting the God of classical theism into the first premise, then I am not begging anything. I'm simply saying, all right, we have an omniscient God. Can this omniscient God in premise 2 be susceptible to Cartesian scenarios? Well, let's think. What is it to be deceived? Well, that means that there's information that you don't have. Okay, is that information existing? Yes. Would an existing information be true propositions? Yes. Does this thing know all true propositions? Yes. So then how could it be deceived? There's no begging the question. I'm just reasoning from the premises that have been given to me.
If you reason from the premises that have been given to you, then it follows that the antecedent of the very first conditional is false, right? If that's how you're construing it, then it follows logically. I can write out simply formally how that's true. So let me just ask you a question. If all the is the argument invalid?
Yes.
Do you think that okay, well, sorry, so what's the faulty inference?
Premise 2.
Premise 2 isn't an inference, it's a premise.
I reject premise 2.
So I didn't ask if you reject a premise. I asked if the argument was valid.
The argument is not valid because premise 2 is false.
Do you understand what it means for an argument to be valid?
Yeah, I'm not going to go down this route when it comes to you talking about inference rules and shit like that. I'm saying I reject premise 2, provide an argument, stop obfuscating.
Well, I provided several arguments, but I'm
No,
trying
you
to.
didn't. Just
Yes,
make
I did. I
like
provided
like I
several.
said,
No, I provided several
I am
arguments. I provided
so
a
mentally
hypothetical
exhausted
syllogism.
from listening to this
I
BS and
provided a
not getting any
hypothetical
answers.
syllogism. I provided a hypothetical syllogism, and then I provided a modus ponens argument supporting premise 2. Right, but that's not what I'm trying to get. I'm trying to get you to. I'm trying to understand basically your reasoning here. So I want to get to the very fundamentals of your reasoning
Giving you all of
capacity.
my
So the
reasons.
first thing I want to figure out is if you understand what a valid argument is. Do you understand what a valid argument is?
Yeah, a valid argument just means something that that necessarily follows.
Yeah, if all of the premises are true, then the conclusion can't be false. It follows necessarily from the truth of the premises, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
there's
okay.
a sub conclusion in premise 2 that if mind internalism is true, or if God exists, hold on, let me look at the premise again. If God sans creation exists as a mind without an external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. That is a sub-conclusion within premise 2 that I reject. Show me the argument for that sub-conclusion.
We'll get to that, right? But the first thing I
No,
want to do,
I'm good everywhere up
I'm
until
trying.
this. I'm tired of talking about anything else. I want that answer. That's my
Okay.
problem. Give
Right, but
me a
every time we
solution
go
for
back
that.
to, and I give you the answer, every time I give you the answer, you go back to this thing
What's the
about God
answer?
being presupposed. Well, I gave the
So
argument. I have to think about the argument again because I didn't write it down. But the basic idea is for premise 2 is if internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are possible. So
no.
what's the argument for that?
If
That is
God
premise 2.
sans creation exists as a mind without an external world, then
What is
Cartesian
validity?
scenarios are logically possible. That
So
means the
Yeah,
yeah,
God who is
that
omniscient.
follows from but that follows from premise 1 and premise 2.
Exactly. So we're still talking about an omniscient God.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
This is why I said I wanted to talk. This is why I said I wanted to talk about what you were talking about with that's with God, because every single time you go back to this thing about like, are we talking about God? That's why I wanted That's why I wanted to walk you through the reasoning process. So that's why I started with: is the argument valid? Now that you understand, maybe presumably with what a valid argument is, then I want you to tell me: is this argument, the argument that I sent to you, is it valid?
The argument that I'm looking at is not valid. No.
The one that I sent you.
I don't see where you sent me anything. Let me
Yeah,
look.
look in your DMs. I don't know. I
Okay.
sent you.
If God has beliefs, so okay, how are we defining God?
Define it any way you want.
Okay, an omniscient
The only
being.
thing you need to look at to figure out if it's valid is if the form is valid. That's all you need to look at. We don't need to put any content in there.
Okay. If God has beliefs sans creations of an external world, then internalism regarding mental content is true. Okay, mind internalism is true. Cool. If internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. Okay, I don't have a problem with that, but we're talking about God and omniscient being. So show me how premise 2 applies to God and we can move on. Same
We'll get to
question
that.
that I've
We'll
been
get to
asking
that.
for a month.
We'll get to that because I'm trying to simplify it for you, but you have to understand everything while I simplify it. So
I
the
think
first conclusion
everybody in
is
the
it.
room, including myself, who's a philosophical idiot, understands it up to this point. Do you mind just answering the question? You said we'll get to that. Well, let's just get to it because I'm pretty sure
Right.
if the
Well,
idiot
yeah, but
if the village
my
idiot
getting
gets
to
it,
it,
then we're all here.
my getting to it is the response I've given several times, which has not been understood thus far. That's why I'm saying I'll get to it. Right. The point of me getting to it is so that I can break down my reasoning of how I'm getting to that view. Right. And so
Understood or accepted?
basically, my point is. The reason I don't want to get to it now is because I'm saying if what
Because you're
he's
stalling.
saying is if what he is saying is true, that God is understood as omniscient, qua the definition. Now, what that's going to imply is that P implies not P, and if it's true that P implies not P, then it just follows from that alone that not P is true, that there is no God, that there is nothing of that kind. Right
For you to
now,
say P implies not P means you have to accept premise 2, which I deny. Give me an argument for premise 2 and go.
fine. Right. I was just the point that the point that I was trying to make with this was is it valid, right? I asked the question if it's valid. I haven't gotten a clear answer to that. So let's just figure out if the argument is valid. Do you think that
No,
the
I
argument is
just said
valid?
yes. Yes, that's
Okay.
valid. If we're not talking about an omniscient being, that is valid.
No. It's valid. Look, it's valid irrespective of whether we're not talking about an omniscient being, right? Because you
That's
can
the
just
point.
replace.
Provide an argument, and that goes right to premise 2.
Because the
Stop
form,
beating
because
around the bush and get to the point.
no, I'll provide the argument. Right?
Then
Because
just do it.
validity, sorry, yeah, okay, because validity is understood in terms of the structure of the argument, not in terms of the argument's content. And so if we replace God with an omniscient being in the first premise, all of the premises follow logically. It
No,
follows
they
that if
don't.
every premise, sorry, stop talking. If every premise is true, the conclusion can't be false. That is to say, if an omniscient being has beliefs, sans an external world, then internalism regarding mental content is true. If that's true, right, assume premise 1 is true. Then if internalism regarding mental content is true, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. Assume that's true, right? Then it follows, but via hypothetical syllogism, if there's an omniscient being that has beliefs, sans an external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. That's 1 and 2 hypothetical syllogism. Now, do you reject the hypothetical syllogism?
I reject what you just said because it wasn't an argument to the premises that I dismiss.
I was asking if the argument was valid, right?
It's
I
valid
was
as long as
not.
you're not talking about an omniscient mind, which is very
No,
interesting
wait,
that
no.
now
I'm
you are
trying to
arguing that it does
look.
apply to an omniscient mind.
Can
When
I ask
just
a dumb
before
question?
Moshe asked you a question, he said are you arguing that an omniscient mind is susceptible to Cartesian scenarios? You said no. Now you're arguing that it is. Which one is it, dude? Pick a struggle.
No, I already explained that the problem was the question is incoherent. So you can give either answer and be correct because the concept is incoherent, right?
Yeah. You're
That's
saying
the
that it's
point.
correct, but that's assuming premise 2,
Look,
which I deny. Provide an argument and go.
It's fine if you reject premise 2. That's not what I'm interested in right now. I will get to
I
premise 2
know. None of you guys are
until
interested
we'll
in
get to
my
premise 2. We'll
objection.
get to premise 2 when you stop having the error in reasoning that I'm accusing you of, right?
I
And
don't
so
have an
that's
error in
what.
reasoning.
Yeah,
Wait, so I have a
the
question.
error
Before
in
we address
reasoning is
that,
that the error in reasoning is that you think that positing an omniscient agent somehow makes the argument invalid, and it doesn't make the argument invalid. In fact, you can assume in all of the premises where you replace God with an omniscient being that the argument is still valid, right? You can just replace
No,
it,
not
and then
right.
the argument will still be valid.
Not right.
Okay, so again, a question from the village idiot. So, I don't understand if how something can know everything, how there's any way in which they could be deceived because they know everything. That's the first question I had. And,
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Post
that, I think that's
argument
a
in the
pretty
chat for
simple
everybody to
question.
see, like the room chat.
I'm sorry, Sasha, could you say that?
How could we get the argument in the room chat for everybody to see?
I was
I'll
trying
put
to
it in the
copy and
chat.
paste it, it wouldn't let me. And then, I had a second question, and
Here
now
you
I
go, Sasha.
forget,
I'll send
freaking
it to
remember
you.
what it was.
I just put it in the chat.
Oh, okay. Here's my
There's
other
going to be
question.
two
So
separate
wait, babe. I
arguments.
have my other question. So my other question was, um, premise one and premise two seem to be based on this idea that the classical God of logic, or any omniscient being, however we're going to stage that later in the argument, is bound and kind of we're putting them in the same category that we could put humans in. Now I could see this premise being about humans and it being perfectly valid, but we're putting an omniscient God in the same. We're putting these kind of same limitations on an omniscient God, and I think that that's a fallacy from the beginning. So is that a presupposition of this whole argumentation even before premise one? Because if it is, then to me it's a fallacy from the beginning because it's not the true definition of God.
Correct. And thank you. That's exactly my point. Is that if we are
Thank
starting
you.
with the premise of the God of classical theism, that means we're talking about an omniscient God. Then in premise two, it says that an omniscient God can also have things that it doesn't know. That's nonsensical to even state in a premise. That's just a claim. Show me how something that knows all true propositions doesn't know all true propositions. I'll wait for the argument like I have been for the last month.
Look, you just don't even understand what's being
Yeah, and
said, right?
well, no. I
Yeah,
think
there
we
we
understand
go.
perfectly. I think the problem is that it's not an issue with our reasoning. It's an issue with the initial proposition having a correct definition in order to make your claims true. That's the problem.
Irrespective of the definition, right? The argument is valid, right? You guys all agree with that?
No, absolutely
The
not.
argument.
Because the definition
Well,
of
then
what
I
we're
just don't even
saying is
understand because
susceptible to
look,
Cartesian
validity
scenarios
is a formal
is
notion. Validity.
implicitly valid.
I just want to say validity is a formal notion, right? So you can put any content inside the premises. Essentially, the form of the argument is P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R, right? That's the first argument. Therefore, P implies R,
So are
right?
you asking us if
This,
we think it was written the right way?
yeah, I'm
Is
saying
that
the
what you're
content.
asking?
See, what
Yeah, I'm
happens is
saying the
when you get
content.
them to break it down into layman's terms and they don't try to use all their fancy technological mumbo jumbo, that they can't
Oh yeah,
actually
fancy
explain.
technology. I explained it several times. I'm just trying to get you to understand the error in reasoning that you're
Yeah, but
making.
but my wife
If you
just
think
my
that the
wife hold
content,
on hold on
if
my
you think
wife
that the
just told
content
you that
matters,
that
then
she
you don't understand what validity is.
how does saying the words P, R, and Q have anything to do with helping my wife, who said she's a layman in philosophy, understand what the fuck you're talking about?
Oh wow.
Well, I can try explaining it. I can try explaining it several ways,
I
right?
don't
But
understand how the definition is irrelevant to the conclusion. Because the conclusion is to give some kind of claim to said definition, to the God of classical theism. So if we're not on page in defining that, then we can't possibly come to a conclusion on that. So I do think it begs a what baby? An agreed upon definition. Because if it does not, then we cannot move forward
we
at
can
all.
agree.
Because
We can
the
agree
conclusion
upon.
is the conclusion is the God of classical theism, therefore, blah 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 blah. So unless that definition is clear, which you're saying it doesn't matter, I mean that's really like I'm kind of really uncomfortable with you saying it doesn't matter.
The reason it doesn't matter is that I can take any definition of God you want and put it into the argument and show that it's still valid.
Right, because you're
That's
putting
why it
God
doesn't
in the
matter.
same box as human. You're giving him the exact
No,
same
it doesn't have
parameters as
anything
human.
to
You have to
do.
be. If the
It doesn't have
hold on, baby.
anything to
If
do
the
with making.
definition is irrelevant, then that means that it's a general description, and that general description according to the way that you're coming about this argument, seems as though it's giving this God, however you're choosing to define him or saying it doesn't matter, then that would be implicit of the fact that it's giving him the same parameters as any human, and therefore the argumentation is based on a human parameter, not a God parameter, and therefore makes it invalid when it comes to an omniscient God. I don't understand what's confusing about this. I know nothing about philosophy, and you're not making sense.
Because look, all right, let me tell you. Let me explain validity to you in a very simple example, right? If now just assume that everything I'm saying is true, and then you'll understand, right?
See, that's what we're
So,
missing.
well, let me just
No, just let
let
him
me just
go, babe.
explain
Just
to
let
her.
him go.
Yeah, let me just
We
explain to
have
her. So if I
Leave
said
to
to you,
Socrates.
stop talking. If I said to you, if it rained yesterday, then the streets are wet. It rained yesterday, therefore the streets are wet, right? Do you understand how that argument could be true?
No,
What?
doesn't necessarily follow. If it rained
What?
yesterday, that doesn't mean that it's wet right now.
That would be to reject a first premise, right? But that's not what I'm talking
No,
about.
the
I'm
first
saying if
premise
we
is it rained
assume
yesterday. How does that
No,
logically
no,
follow
yeah.
that that the
the
roads
first
are wet
premise is
now?
if it rained yesterday. The first premise is if it rained yesterday, then the streets are wet. It rained yesterday is the second premise, therefore the streets are wet. Now, if you assume
Why are you just
the
using one
truth,
That
word?
doesn't make sense.
I'm no like genuine question. Like you're
you're
literally
saying
taking
that
one word
modus
and acting
ponens
like it's
doesn't
saying
make
two
sense.
different things.
Galvis,
No,
you
no,
said
no,
that
no, no,
these were the
no.
smartest people. They're
Guess
saying that
what?
modus
Guess what?
ponens
Guess
doesn't
what,
make
Jack?
sense.
Guess what?
This fucking
Guess what? Guess what? Guess what? It rained yesterday where I live. I'm looking at the streets right now. They're pretty freaking dry.
that's just
Exactly.
You're
rejecting
looking at our
the
street.
That's about
first premise.
soundness. That's about soundness.
Are you looking? Wait, are you looking at our street?
No, that's
No,
just
no,
rejecting the first
I'm looking at
premise.
a street. I'm looking at an area to where it rained yesterday,
Exactly.
and he is saying in the first premise, it rained
Yeah, he's
yesterday.
just lying to
If
you.
it
Don't
rained
listen to him.
yesterday, then the streets are wet. Are wet. That means if I look at the street right now, it's going to be wet. I'm looking at the street and it's dry. It's not valid. It doesn't necessarily follow. Try a better argument.
It's not valid. You think that the first
Wait,
premise
I don't even
and the
want to
second
argue about
premise could
rain.
both be
Hold on.
true?
I don't want to argue about rain. I want to know why switching out then and therefore somehow is saying two different things.
Right. I'll explain. I'll explain that. Right. Okay. So we have what's called an implication, right? And that's just if and then you take the first premise or the what's called the antecedent is the first half, the first part. If X, then Y. X is true, therefore Y is true. This is very common reasoning, right? So that's why I gave you an example. So you can say, if I ate an hour ago, then I'll be full. I ate an hour ago, therefore I'm full. Do you understand that? Do you understand that
That
while you might
follows.
not
That's
think
good. That works.
that follows, it's the same form.
No, it's no, it's no,
Yeah, it's the
no, it's
same
not.
You,
form,
It's
but
not.
this one actually makes more sense
Look,
because
what Josh is
there's other
saying is that
factors. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? With the rain, there's other factors that can make the statement untrue, which is what we're saying is the
Yeah,
problem
but
with
he's
your
not
argument.
talking about. Yeah, but that's the thing. He's not talking about soundness. He's talking about validity.
yeah,
Okay,
what
fine.
Josh is trying to say is that when you're talking about validity, you're not really concerned about the meanings of or the content of of the propositions that the premises are consist of that they consist of. You're not concerned with the content of the premises, right? So you're just trying to understand whether the form is good or not.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think a better one to
So when I
understand
asked
that's
if
in
he thought,
philosophy 101. Babe, here, take this one.
I was just gonna ask. So
Socrates.
when can I just ask real quick? So when he was asking us about the validity, blah blah blah, and I asked him back, "Are you asking us if it's written in the correct form?" Could he have just said yes
Yep,
and
he
we
could
moved
have.
on? Okay.
He could have.
Well, I think you might have
So,
been using
the
differences
first
of form.
premise is Socrates is a man. Men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Well, you got to have the if it's a conditional in the first premise if you want modus ponens.
Well,
Yeah.
that's
So if Socrates is a man, and if and men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, that would be valid. I mean, obviously it would be sound because we know that it's true that Socrates is a man. But let's just say we switched it to immortal, right? Men are immortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. It wouldn't be true, it wouldn't be sound, but it would still logically follow from the premises. But the whole rain thing, it doesn't logically follow. Just because it rained yesterday doesn't logically follow
Oh,
that the
but
streets
there
are
you're
wet.
being you're concerned with the content. It's not about. It could be it could be something like this, right? If I screamed, then a nuclear bomb goes off. I screamed, therefore a nuclear bomb goes off. That's a valid argument, right? It's not
Yeah, I
sound. You're
agree with that one, but the one about the rain is not valid.
Wait, but he's just said if it rained yesterday, then it's wet outside or something. It rained yesterday, therefore it's wet outside. That's a valid argument.
Okay, I don't know how it is, but that's fine. I don't get it.
Well,
that's
I think you're just concerned with rejecting the first premise, but that doesn't matter with respect to validity.
Okay, so getting back to this argument, where does this argument of validity play into this argument? Because the claim is that if the God of classical theism, which is defined as an omniscient being that knows all true propositions, how could this omniscient being be susceptible to Cartesian scenarios, which are scenarios where there's knowledge that true propositions that this mind is not aware of? How can an omniscient being also be not omniscient?
Yeah, I think I listened to the
right.
conversation. I want to
Wait, Dave,
frame.
doesn't that violate the law of identity?
Uh,
Did I
No,
remember
it's
that
What
not
the
right?
law of
contradiction.
identity?
well,
Not a
I've been listening to the
contradiction.
conversation, Khalil. So let me frame the problem here.
Danny, let me see
Suppose
if I can explain. I want to explain it to you, Danny.
No, no, no,
well,
no, no,
I
no,
do
no.
understand
I
though.
want to hear Danny talk.
But do
I've
you
been
understand
listening.
why I was
Blabber
saying
on.
that
No, I
you
don't
understand
understand why
why I
you
was
say
saying
anything.
that if you understand, I was talking to Danny. Danny, you understand why what I was saying is that
Stop
if they
trying to load
import
it up. Just let
omniscience,
him talk.
sorry, stop. If they import omniscience into the definition, then the reduction of the argument is P implies not P. You understand that, right?
Yeah, I do understand that.
And
But
so you can follow just from that. Would follow
Just
just
shut
from
up and
that.
let him talk,
I'm
dude.
trying to I'm trying to have a
Hold on,
conversation with
hold
No,
on,
Danny.
hold
no.
on,
What
hold
you're
on, hold
So
on.
doing
you
is what
So
my
so
you're
you
saying that
what
understand.
my
premise two
kids
would
do.
say
It's what my
would
kids
basically
do.
imply that the God of classical theism is not omniscient. That's what you're
well,
saying.
here's what I'm going to do, Josh. I'm going to try to explain. You just cut me off if I'm not tracking. But this
Well,
is
I just want to get clear. I just want to make sure that you understand the inference that it follows.
I know he's
If
trying to
that
load
reduction
you
is
up and
true,
butter you up with his
that
ideas so
P
you can agree
implies
with it. It's what my kids do when they're trying to
sorry that
tell you
P
that they're
implies
getting in
not
trouble.
P. Sorry, if it's P implies not P, then it just follows from that premise alone that not P is true, right? You understand that too,
yeah, I
right?
do. Yeah.
You
Okay.
just asked the same question. Can you shut up and let him talk?
So what's been going on is let's just use an analogy. Let's say Josh was trying to give an argument for why all tables in some room are triangular, right? And so he says if there's a table in the room, then it's triangular and whatever, right? He gives this argument, right? But you think that that the tables are in fact so he's giving an argument for why the tables must be triangular or something like that. And you're saying that, well, I think that the tables are square or something like that. And so the idea there is that you would just be rejecting the first premise that if there are tables in the room, then they're triangular,
Well, no, no,
right?
no, no, no.
But it wouldn't
We've
make the
already
argument
agreed,
invalid,
Danny.
right?
We've already agreed that we're defining God as an omniscient being. So in premise one, here, let me send you the